Right. I first met, so I'm very delighted to introduce Soren Brothers, who's going to, well, you can see his title there. He's the Allan and Helaine Shiff Curator of Climate Change at the ROM. I first met Soren when his family moved in on Huron Street, across from where I lived by my family quite a number of years ago. And when he was in high school, he expressed an interest in studying biology in university. And since neither of his parents was a biologist, they sent him over to talk to me and to my husband, who was heavily involved in conservation biology, which in fact was turned out to be Soren's specialty. In the end, he went to UBC, and then he did a master's in Montreal and a PhD in Potsdam. And I heard from his mother now and then about what he was up to. That included work in Nunavut, Quebec's boreal forests, and the Great Lakes. And he's still, I believe, pretty involved with the Great Lakes, which is an important topic around here. And he was assistant, before he came here, back here, he was an assistant professor of limnology. We're going to find out more about what limnology is at Utah State University. I can't imagine there are a great many lakes in Utah, but then I've hardly ever been there. Anyway, imagine how amazed I was to open one of the Toronto papers sometime back in 2021. And here is a full page ad with a picture of Soren. And you can imagine how he could fill a full page ad from top to bottom, announcing the ROM Allan and Helaine Shiff Curator of Climate Change as, in fact, the first curator of climate change in the world. So Soren today is going to tell us about limnology and what a curator of climate change does in a talk entitled Climate, Lakes, and Museums, Intersections and Opportunities. Sorry.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sara. And can everyone hear me all right as well? Great. Let me just make sure that this is, oh, maybe, okay, there, oh, okay. I figured I would just begin with a quick land acknowledgement to recognize that the work that I'm doing at the ROM, especially right now, and of course where we are here as well at U of T, adjacent to it, is on the ancestral lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. And with that, I wanted to give a really quick outline of what I'm going to be speaking for the next, I guess, 45 or 50 minutes, or what topics I'm going to be covering. As Sara mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about limnology and putting on my limnologist hat there. Looks a little bit like a dunce, but that wasn't intentional. And then this other hat is a climate change communicator, which is linking to the work that I'm doing right now at the ROM. And I'm going to tie these things together into a little bit of future research directions that I'm taking through my ROM, which also comes actually with a faculty appointment at the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department here at U of T. And that's the magic sort of sorcerer or wizard hat there. So I'll come back to that later on. So I didn't want to, I didn't actually know Sara was going to be introducing me and telling me to that story. So I figured I would also begin with really what originally brought me here today, which is Sara, and the early relationship that I had with Sara as a neighbor growing up. We moved to, so I was born in Mississauga, but we moved to downtown Toronto to Huron Street around 1992 or so. And I couldn't find any pictures from me in high school, but this is me at UBC, probably about a year or two after Sara had given me the great advice on being a biologist. And there I have a bird on my hand. So I was pretty, I was in a good spot, and it was definitely a good fit for what I was interested in doing. And you get a sense too that I was, you know, what I was interested in at that time was really kind of engaging with nature and conserving nature and protecting it. And I always had this kind of, you know, even entering entering my undergraduate degree, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go into biology, where I could potentially bring new knowledge forward that would help conserve nature, or to go even into political science, where I could actually develop policies that would help protect nature. So I ended up doing a major in conservation biology and a minor in political science, kind of splitting the difference. As Sarah mentioned, I did my master's in actually at UQAM, University of Quebec at Montreal. And there I was working on greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. So I'm going to give a very quick overview just of my research background. And essentially that was me in near James Bay at Hydroelectric Reservoir. And the work that we were doing there was trying to quantify how much, what the carbon dioxide and methane emissions were from these systems, as generators of hydroelectricity. And essentially lakes are natural sources of greenhouse gases. And so what we're looking at is this question of how do we interact with the waters, and what does that change in terms of their altered greenhouse gas emissions? So what is the role that we have as societies in terms of altering natural carbon dynamics and carbon fluxes, and ultimately greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere? So you can see kind of from the beginning, I was thinking, I basically, saw this job as a master's student in Montreal as a job, but what really pulled me to it was not even directly the lakes aspect of it, but the climate aspect from the beginning. For my PhD in Berlin, I was actually working with tipping points and feedbacks in systems. And I don't think I mentioned it explicitly, but limnology is the study of inland waters. So this is kind of the string that ties through, the thread that ties through all of this research that I started doing in disparate areas. One of the other interesting aspects of lakes is that they can change very suddenly from one state to another. So actually it was a Dutch limnologist, Martin Scheffer, who in 1994 started writing papers about what he called critical transitions in lakes. And a lot of that ended up really filling out a lot of our knowledge of how we understand social systems to work, and also planetary systems in terms of tipping points and feedback loops and the importance of those, rather than just thinking of systems responding gradually to changes. So I did my PhD in Berlin looking at two lakes. This was one of them, just in Brandenburg, a couple hours outside of Berlin, looking at understanding how these critical switches between clear and turbid states in lakes, which involve these biological and chemical and physical feedbacks within the systems, how that changes both the primary production, so the production of organic matter in those systems, and also the greenhouse gas emissions and the food web itself. And then I moved back here. I did a postdoc at the University of Guelph. I was actually running a NSERC CREATE program, looking at multiple stressors and cumulative effects in the Great Lakes. And these are, of course, as probably many of you know, the largest, cumulatively the largest, or I should say collectively, largest freshwater ecosystem on the planet. And this was a picture of Lake Superior that I didn't take, but it gives you a sense of the scale if you haven't been there yourself. And again, I was starting to apply these same kind of theories and these same ideas to thinking about how humans and climate, in this sense, both interact to change how these systems are functioning. So for instance, we published some work on Lake Superior looking at 40 years of oxygen data from monitoring systems and seeing how climate change was interacting with sort of long-term climate trends, were interacting with short-term climate impacts, for instance, from El Nino years, to change these sudden sort of basic functioning sort of carbon dioxide emissions and oxygen dynamics within the lake. And I'll just mention briefly the last position I had, which was at Utah State University. As was mentioned, there is one big lake in Utah. And I remember I had the same thought when I remember flying into Utah for the job and looking at the desert below and thinking, like, what are they doing hiring a limnologist here? But this is actually me with a master's student of mine, Melissa Cobo, out on Great Salt Lake. And it is actually pink. That's not a issue of the color. That's actually the color of that part of the lake because it's so hypersaline. So again, it kind of opened up new questions about new chemistries and new sort of biological systems and how they can influence basically how aquatic ecosystems function. One of the interesting things that we ended up focusing on with Great Salt Lake, which we just published this summer, is that it is a lake that's shrinking because of human water withdrawal. So there's a lot of agriculture there, a lot of wasteful agriculture. for instance, into alfalfa. There's a political system that's use it or lose it with the water, so that people try and use as much water as they can to retain their water rights. And we found that that has already shrunk the lake by about 50%. And one of Melissa's projects for her master's was actually to go around, and this was starting in March 2020, so it was a fun time to hire a student. But she went around every 2 weeks to this dried out lake bed and measured carbon dioxide and methane fluxes from it. And we found that that was, essentially an anthropogenic, human-caused source of emissions because humans were drying up the lake. And it would add about 4.1, it was adding about 4.1 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to the year every year. So accounting for about a 7% increase in the state of Utah's CO2 emissions that was not being counted and is still not being really considered. So it kind of comes back even to, you can see an echo of the first work I was doing as a master's student, looking at what happens when we flood landscapes and how they have high CO2 emissions. And now I ended up looking at what happens when you desiccate lakes and they have high CO2 emissions as well. So we can see these kind of relationships with our decisions with waters. So to kind of tie all these things together, this is again me in a different part, a greener part of Great Salt Lake. One of the nice things about working in limnology is that us limnologists like to say it was actually considered by some to be maybe the first sort of holistic of the Western sciences or fields of Western science. So, to be a limnologist, the first paper that came out in this field is arguably looking at Lake Geneva. And you can't really, if you're interested in fish, historically you'd become an ichthyologist, or if you're interested in plants, you'd have to become a botanist. But if you wanted to understand what a fish in Lake Geneva was doing, you have to understand what the food web, how the food web is working. You have to understand the physics of how the lake is actually mixing to understand where you can have, primary production. You have to understand the chemistry of the system to understand what can live in there. Then you start looking at the geology of the landscape to understand how that's influencing the chemistry and what humans are doing in that landscape. And so you get into social, environmental dynamics. So when you look at a lake, you're always thinking at the system level. And you can't really ignore or just focus in on one part without trying to capture everything else and how it interrelates. And so that makes it a really nice platform as a limnologist for someone who's a little bit scattered like me to look into lots of different elements and how they're all relating, and whether it's at the global scale or the molecular scale. But also for a platform then coming into something like the ROM, where we can think about planetary tipping points and planetary sort of at the next sort of system level. And this is actually pretty common for limnologists as well, to think, this from the scale of the lake to the scale of the planet being kind of the next scale up as sort of semi-closed systems. And societal and planetary interactions can't be ignored. This was a really nice thing. Again, moving into, shifting now into the climate communications aspect. I was in Utah teaching undergraduates climate change, largely conservative. I was told when I went there that I would have complaints to the university because I was teaching climate change that I was propagandizing. But it was really nice to be able to enter that as a limnologist and say, I can't ignore climate change. I don't choose to bring it in with the work that I'm doing. It's just simply that every single lake that I've studied everywhere on the planet is getting warmer, and that's part of its change. And so we have to, if we try to ignore that or we try to pretend that that's not happening, we're only going to understand part of the reality of the situation and of these changes. So it was a nice sort of fallback position to be in. And again, that makes it a situation where climate is central, but it's not politicized. So you can say that, we really are able to focus on that, but and again, as a teaching mechanism, I could ask students what their favorite lake to go fishing was in. And then I could bring in the local state monitoring agent who could bring in that monitoring data, and we could see that it's getting warmer. And then we could have discussions about how that's going to impact the fish that they like to fish. And it's kind of taking it away from this politicized thing. We don't have to go into COP meetings or global climate modeling. We could just talk about what's happening there locally and the implications of that. So at that time, I heard about this endowment of a position at the ROM. And again, at being from Toronto, it was really interesting. I grew up going to the ROM all the time. And there was this new creation of a position by Allan and Helaine Shiff as a climate change curator. And I had no experience in the museum world prior to that, but they were looking for someone who would still be able to do research, but was doing work in the climate sphere. So I ended up basically arguing along those same lines that I was in a position, I'd cut my teeth in a very conservative, teaching climate change in a very conservative community in the States, and looking at climate change from this perspective of water, which is really something that unites a lot of different communities, whether it's indigenous communities or conservative communities as well. A lot of people, everyone has an invested interest in water and in good water quality and understanding our relationship to it. So I was hired a few years ago, and it was, as we know, as far as we know, the first position of its kind. There are 3 climate change curators I know of globally now, including myself. The other is Jenny Newell, who actually was doing climate change work at the Australian Museum before I started, but I don't think she had that title. And then Ken Perenata is a newer climate change curator at the Sainsbury Centre in England. But it's interesting because we all actually have very different backgrounds professionally. So Jenny has a background in environmental history, working with Pacific nations, and sort of in biogeography, and then Ken Perenata has a contemporary art background, and he works with contemporary artists and commissions. And so we all have exactly the same job title, but we actually have regular or semi-regular conversations now, and thinking about where we all meet between these different backgrounds that we bring to this position in our respective museums. So Sara had asked me originally to talk about what a climate change curator does. I wanted to give that background just to give some context to where I came into this position from. I thought beyond that, it would be good to suggest or to show where I started with this position in terms of what I actually proposed, what I thought it should be. And it's nice that I'm at a position now 3 years in that I can give a bit of reflection on that. So that's what I'm going to do next. But this is actually a slide that I haven't used in a while, but this was from my interview actually for the job, what I said that I would want to do as a climate change curator. So for one, it was obviously important to bring attention to the issue of climate change and use the museum as a platform where we can talk about what is happening to our planet and why, and just sort of keep that as part of the conversation. And this is still from an artwork by Ólafur Eliasson, an Icelandic artist, where he brought pieces of glaciers, of icebergs rather, to Paris. They were melting and people were interacting with them. But I also wanted to bring action into the role. So not just leave it as attention, but thinking about what are ways that the museum can support climate mitigation initiatives, and what are ways that, in terms of not only the museum's own carbon footprint, but also thinking of it as a provincial institution, how can we advance reductions in climate change in terms of carbon emissions. And then I also wanted to bring in this adaptation element as well. So also, how is the museum helping advance through programming, through exhibitions, through all these different mechanisms, climate adaptation in the community? Because we are in this really interesting role in museums as a community space and a government institution and a research institute. So there's a lot of power there that I thought all of these 3 A's, as I kind of define them, could be advanced through the museum. And I argued at the time that there was relevance of my research to the ROM. So again, thinking about the community kind of role and what's happening in cities, I argued that we could have, for instance, there's work by Don Jackson here in my department, EEB, looking at stormwater ponds right now and looking more at their kind of ecological significance. But we can also think about what is the greenhouse gas footprint of a stormwater pond. And these are effectively climate adaptation measures in a way. I mean, they're part of the city's urban expansion, but they also control against flooding, for instance. We also have Cladophora blooms in Lake Ontario. So that's this kind of green, snotty stuff. And that's actually one of the areas of research that I specialize in, is looking at filamentous algae in lakes. And so I argued that I could do work with there and trying to understand how these new blooms, which in some places, for instance, in the Rockies, where I was in Utah, are associated with warming, and seeing what does this mean for carbon cycling in these systems too, and for biodiversity and all of these other sort of climate interactions. I also argued that there was, my broader experience working with waters, as I mentioned to you earlier. Toronto and Ontario more broadly is a place that's defined by water. And we have these lost rivers under the city. We have the ravines that shape the city. These are places of cultures and stories and natural history, and also really important to Ontario's Indigenous communities. So again, these are all slides from my initial interview with the museum. And then thinking about the future of Toronto and what kind of role a museum could play. So, we're in a place that there is predicted and observed increases in precipitation. We are a climate haven. We're perceived as a climate haven in terms of being far from the coast, so we don't have to worry about sea level rise. We're not dealing with the drought and wildfires of the west. We're not dealing with the heat waves of the south. So we are a place that there is expected to be a major increase in population. And so how we grow, and even in terms of urbanization, I think is also an element. And the flood impacts of that, and filling out and paving over our watersheds, are tied in with global climate trends in some ways. So we have opportunities in terms of bringing more attention to the risks and trying to think about how we're growing, but also in terms of thinking about these buried systems and buried creeks from the 1800s and early 1900s that have all been channelized into sewers, and what kind of opportunities do these bring to us now? And I'm going to come back to that at the end. So I'll leave you off with that much limnology. Hopefully it wasn't too much, but now I'm going to be able to go into this question of what have I actually been able to do once I got that job. So I figure all of you are familiar with the ROM since you all live here. So I figured I would speak more broadly to just the first observations that I had, even starting at the ROM and seeing what the differences were between being at a university, which is all I'd been really experiencing before, and being at a museum. So of course, at the museum, we think about visitors. So we do have 1.3 million visitors per year, plus digital engagement. So there's a lot of people from all walks of life, which is a pretty interesting position to be in. I mean, there's not a certain political group that wants to go see the dinosaurs with their grandkids, for instance. There's a lot of teaching opportunities. So it has an active education and pedagogical program, including summer camps for youth. There's an expectation to have a continued research program. Polls have shown that museums are actually, I think in US and Canada and probably elsewhere, they're amongst the most trusted source of information, along with doctors, with GPs. So it's kind of a funny role that, we're more trusted than government as a source of information, and we're more trusted than academic institutions as a source of information, even though we are both a government and academic institution. So there's something there that I think is really valuable in terms of climate communication. ROM specifically, it's a transdisciplinary institute. So a lot of museums historically had arts and culture and natural history exhibitions or natural history collections, and then they split into natural history museums or art galleries. ROM never made that split, and now it's coming back as a really nice opportunity to have both of these, have arts and culture curators that I work alongside with natural history curators. It's non-political, multiple generations. So it's, again, these very broad audiences that we can interact with. That helps us potentially organize interesting citizen science programs. If we want to mobilize large groups of people, we can ask these large complex questions, again, from the curatorial expertise that we have at the museum, and boost public engagement with research outcomes. So thinking about as a researcher and ongoing scientist, there's a lot of interesting opportunities to then translate that into public programs directly with the same colleagues that I'm working in, even in exhibitions. So one of the things that I also was first faced with when I joined the ROM was this question of, or realization that not all curators at all museums have the same jobs. So actually there's a very strictly defined role or series of roles that ROM curators are expected to do. First and foremost is this expectation of research and publications. And again, this is not all museums have that with their curatorial or have that expectation of being a research institute. But these are all kind of, you can think of them most as either as priorities, but also boxes that I had to check in terms of being able to stay at the ROM as a curator. And I'd used actually this picture. This is from a recent publication of Jean-Bernard Caron, the curator of invertebrate zoology, who identified from some Burgess shale fossils early jellyfish species. We also, of course, have acquisitions and collections management, so kind of a classic curatorial role of bringing in new objects and taking care of them. Exhibitions and gallery work, so actually bringing in rotations in the gallery, potentially creating new galleries, teaching and mentoring expectations, outreach programs and community service. So all of these things are requirements for a ROM curator to be fulfilling. And you can imagine that for most curators, it would go kind of from top to bottom. that you would have, for instance, if you're a paleontologist, you would put in a research grant, and that gets you some money to go to Alberta, collect some bones, that becomes your collections. And then you hire some students to work on those collections. They start going into the exhibitions. You get a new dinosaur bone in the gallery. Those students and the classes you teach on paleontology and the mentoring tie in with that research, with those collections of those dinosaur bones that you've collected. And then they also help you with in terms of community outreach and engaging different audiences and community service, and that kind of comes last. As the climate change curator, though, it was kind of flipped for me because I was, as some were saying, I was the first curator at the museum without a collection. So I didn't really have, and it was expected to be, I would say from the beginning, there was this implicit assumption that I wouldn't be generating a huge climate change collection, but it was really going to be probably more public oriented and public facing as a role. So I was almost starting at the bottom there in terms of outreach and programming, and then working my way up. So the first question then, starting at the bottom and starting as a communicator, was what is climate change as an issue? Where do I want to start with, bring this to the public? And it seems maybe it would be an obvious issue or obvious question for some. So a lot of people think of it as an environmental issue, but not everyone in the public who comes into the ROM identifies as an environmentalist. And I don't want to have people feeling excluded if they're not environmentalists. And it doesn't even really resound or resonate that well for me either, because I think of it more as a biogeochemical issue. You know, I think about carbon cycling and balances and budgets between different sort of natural compartments on the planet. Other people see it as a political issue or a social justice issue or humanitarian issue. And again, it's easy to make arguments for it, but there's also a lot of people coming into the museum who would shy away from that and saying, well, I'm not an activist and I'm not really interested in that, so that's not for me. Other people might see it as an energy issue. It's like, well, you know, if you're really like a energy buff, or you're interested in knowing where your electricity comes from, that's a climate change person. And of course, it's all of these things and a lot more, but it's hard to figure out how we should address it, and which of these, if any of them, I should focus on as a place of communications. And so what I really wanted to do was to try and step back and think more broadly about the communications role that I would be taking and where to kind of address climate change at the museum. And I want to bring in three terms that you're probably all familiar with. I'm going to define them in a way that I don't want to say that this is the authoritative way of defining them, but this is how I distinguish them, at least personally. Multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary work. I consider a lot of the work that I did in Utah to be multidisciplinary. I was really into setting up large collaborative projects, for instance, with Great Salt Lake, where I'd bring in an ornithologist to look at how desiccation was impacting bird dynamics there and bird populations, and bring in a social scientist who was looking at human attitudes towards the lake. But we weren't really working together. And I'd say it's kind of like oil and water. You're in the same room and you're talking and you're interacting, but it's not creating a new sort of chemistry between you. It's just being able to talk about the system together. In terms of interdisciplinary work, I see a lot of the work that I started doing at the museum along these lines, and I'll go into that in a second. I think of that a bit more as like chocolate milk, where you have two ingredients that come together and they do meld together in a really nice way. And so, for instance, a lot of the work I did with water was pretty fun. If I could add a dynamic of water to a dynamic of fashion, for instance, you know, we could talk about these things together, and it put me in a nice role, and it put the other curator that I was working with in a nice position that we could be on the same page and produce something new together. So I think of that as interdisciplinary. I think of transdisciplinary as this chocolate cake, where you're really cooking and you're getting all of these ingredients in, and you're really creating something that's fresh and new from this real kind of advanced level of chemistry almost. And I really love chocolate cake. So that's really what I wanted to focus on in terms of the future of what I would be bringing forward in ROM communication. So I started thinking about how do I develop a transdisciplinary communications approach. And I'm going to come to that. But starting with these outreach programs and teaching at the museum, I started realizing, first of all, museums are very slow institutions. I didn't mention it earlier, but I like to say geologists set the pace at the museum. But the museum tours were the first thing I realized that I could do without having to get any kind of paperwork through or change any galleries. Again, this is also 2021, so the museum was just slowly reopening after the pandemic. But I created this tour called Climate History, Climate Hope that had a lot of interdisciplinary elements. So for instance, I would gravitate especially towards some of the collections, both in the arts and culture, the third floor, and the natural history floor and the second floor, to a lot of them that had aquatic components to them, where I could talk about the limnology work I was doing. For instance, we usually started the tour at stromatolites in the Dawn of Life Gallery, where this is the first oxygen-producing organisms that created the great oxidation event 2.7 billion years ago that led to almost complete sort of snowball Earth and loss of life and mass extinction event at that time. And I was studying stromatolites in the Great Salt Lake just before moving here. So I was able to kind of tie in these personal stories and talk about the history of climate on our planet and climate change solutions. I also did a lot of media interviews, different outreach activities, education initiatives, public screenings. We have an Eaton Theater at the basement in the ROM, where I invited the local photographer, Edward Bertinsky, to joined me in a public screening of his film Watermark from 2014. And we had a public Q&A and conversation after that. And so again, this kind of water and art overlap where we were able to bring in that interdisciplinary side. And I also now, as U of T faculty, I teach a global change ecology course, which I took over from Rowan Sage. And for those who know Rowan, his background is really in plant physiology, and I was able to take a lot of the work that he and Art Weiss had also done on this class, but also then bring it into more aquatic sciences and thinking about the limnology work that I've done. Moving up that step of the different sort of going backwards now through the curatorial expectations in exhibitions and galleries. The first exhibition that I co-curated with Alexandra Palmer, who was our curator of fashion, was called Noelle Hamlin Lifers. So it was actually a local artist, Noelle Hamlin, who had found these life preservers washed up on a beach in Salt Spring Island, BC, when she was doing an artist residency there. And she ended up sewing, she's a textile artist. She actually works down in the theater district as a day job, sort of repairing old, King Lear's costumes and things like that. But she basically stitched these old clothes onto these old discarded life jackets and created this kind of dystopian immersive space that was really a commentary on the role of fast fashion, the global textile industry, on climate change and water quality issues globally. So I hadn't even realized before going into this that it's the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions globally is the global textile industry. So it's a really big, huge player. And actually Environment and Climate Change Canada reached out to me around this time saying, are you doing anything with fashion right now? Because this is one of the biggest gaps in the public awareness, is the role of how many clothes we go through in terms of the impact that that's having globally on both the climate and also water quality and water quantity. So then they ended up helping to support this exhibition. So again, this kind of nice interdisciplinary fashion and water overlap. I also I curated Wildlife Photographer of the Year. So this was a touring exhibition from the Natural History Museum in London. You're maybe familiar with it. It's been happening 9 years now, going at the ROM. And I think this will be its 60th year. So I'm also curating it this year. And there's some nice images actually of the very first awards being given away for the Wildlife Photographer of the Year in England by David Attenborough. So it's a really prestigious, long-running exhibition. And I was able to add some climate change content, especially focusing on waters. So for instance, there was last year a picture of a river they called the Dying River in Jakarta. That was the name of the photograph. And I could bring in stories about, for instance, the Don River and what Toronto's doing to bring the Don River back from having been declared dead in the 1960s here. And all of the different stuff happening, for instance, with climate adaptation, the Portlands. And I'm now working, and it's close to being done, is a development of a critical minerals display case. So working with the geology teams, we're able to talk about what are the minerals that our society needs for the transition to net zero, and bringing in that conversation and what is the role of mining in that transition. How do we make decisions that minimize the need for mining? For instance, a net zero future that is entirely dependent on electric cars has a very different mining impact than a net zero future that doesn't rely entirely on electric cars, but relies more on bicycle infrastructure and public transit. So we're able to kind of bring in this ideas that, first of all, net zero is not just one choice. It's a range and expansion of choices from the current situation. But these choices have consequences in terms of environmental impact still through mining. So now I mentioned that I was the first curator without a collection. I ended up, after about a year in the job, with one collections item. So I couldn't say that anymore. And that was a Crawford Lake sediment core. And I don't know how many people are familiar with Crawford Lake here. Okay, most of the people are. So for those who don't know, it was actually later on to this past year voted as the quote, golden spike candidate of the proposed Anthropocene epoch. Crawford Lake is just about an hour west of here. So a lot of people, and I'll talk about what golden spike of the proposed Anthropocene epoch means in a second, but essentially it put it on the world, on the covers of New York Times, on the covers of newspapers around the world. There was a lot of attention. Essentially, that designated it as the best place on the planet to showcase how humans interact with the planet, or how humans are changing planetary systems, out of a short list of about 12 sites globally. And this, for me, was the first opportunity I felt that was really a transdisciplinary programming exhibitions research opportunity, and going into this conversation of the Anthropocene, which is its own sort of big, it's a big word that a lot of people are starting to use, and a lot of people are still pretty fresh in their understanding of how we use that term and what it means. But you can bring it to a lot of interesting places that are outside of just being restrictively thinking about climate change. So this is Crawford Lake. It's a really small lake for those who haven't been there. You can walk around it in about half an hour. And right adjacent to it are these reconstructed longhouses. And it's interesting because there's actually a long ROM history. So the reason we actually even know about those longhouses is because of a ROM curator, Jock McAndrews, who was also a U of T professor, who in the 1970s started coring in the lake, trying to reconstruct the history of Southern Ontario's forests, looking for evidence for a little ice age from the 1500s to the 1800s. And one of his students, Maria Boyko, his master's student, found some really big pollen. They were doing these work looking at different pollen grains, different trees. And she said, what kind of pollen is this? And he said, well, we have a herbarium here, so look it up. And apparently that was where she was able to find that that was corn pollen, ZMAs. And that was the first evidence. And they realized corn was a non-native species. This was from the 1200s. So there must have been agriculture nearby. So then they started speaking with people who had lived around there and farmed around there. And they realized they all had seen pottery shards and they had collection of materials. So that's what opened up the archaeological excavations that ended up leading to the reconstruction of those longhouses. And so there's a really interesting research history at the museum that we were able to start bringing in with Crawford Lake before we even got to this question of it being on the global stage of defining the Anthropocene. And that now at our current state, we understand those villages to have been Attawandaron or pre-Wendat villages that were farming corn and sunflowers from about 1290s to 1490s. And this is actually the core that's in our collections. It was donated by Francine McCarthy, she's kind of the lead of Team Crawford right now on the global stage. And she did her master's at the ROM with Jock McAndrews back in the 80s. So she has a long history there. We also see the Little Ice Age as a period of change in terms of the core sediments. And I didn't mention, it's hard to see it in this picture, I'm sorry, but you get, actually, I'll go back to this one. You can see these little lines kind of here. And so each of those is 1 year, is one summer. So every summer, the chemistry of the lake is such that every summer you have enough algae growing, and it's right on the Niagara escarpment, so you have a lot of calcium. And when you get the algae growing and mixing with that bicarbonate, it precipitates out as calcium carbonate, and it leaves kind of like a layer of white every summer. And we call that varving. And so you get that varving actually starting around there in the 1290s with that early farming and at that period. So they changed the chemistry of the lake when they were living there. And so this is from the 1290s right here. So this is older than the 1290s. If you imagine a plug of sediment taken from the bottom, and then you can count forward each year to the present year, each summer. So that's why it was so appealing to work on. And so we also can see the little ice age. There's a forest fire you can identify in there. You have a huge change in the color of the lake around 1876, when the Crawford family moved from England and purchased the lake and built a sawmill on it and took down all the trees. You have a North American Dust Bowl event, 1935 is one of the brightest white lines, one of the brightest varves in there. You have increasing fly ash, so from the burning of fossil fuels in the 1950s, a byproduct of probably industry in Hamilton. At around the same time, you have an increase in plutonium signal in the lake, and then that increases right up to 1963, in which case at which point it drops right down again with the signing of the test ban treaty. You have acid precipitation, so the varving actually disappears for a while in the 1990s because the lake became too acidic for calcium carbonate to precipitate. You have a signal of the construction of a local visitor center with some algae blooming around then from the land disturbance. And then you have climate warming and teleconnections. So teleconnections are things like El Nino events or Pacific decadal oscillations. So you can see this really interesting, in one line of sediment locally, this story that's extremely local and global at the same time. And it encompasses indigenous land use change and colonial land use change. And so it's a really powerful storyteller, regardless of this question of the Anthropocene. And I mentioned that it was the golden spike of the Anthropocene. What that means is that, for geologists to consider a new, or any epoch, the convention is to have a place on Earth which defines it. So if you want to see where the distinction is between the Paleocene and the Eocene epoch, there will be usually probably a hillside in China or Italy or somewhere where there's actually a physical brass spike that you can see the difference in the layers of strata. And you can say this is the best place to see, that's the golden spike for that, crossing from one epoch, planetary epoch, to another. So this was seen as the golden spike, or the best place on the planet to mark that golden spike for the Anthropocene. And that was part of the evidence that this Anthropocene working group of geologists had to bring forward to actually having a vote of whether we would actually formalize this idea that we are no longer in the Holocene, but we're in a new epoch. And yeah, so as I was kind of getting to there, the Anthropocene is this consideration of a new epoch defined by human impacts on the planet. And it's become a more and more popular term, actually. When I started teaching global change ecology 2 years ago, most of my students had never heard of Crawford Lake or the Anthropocene. And then last year, I brought it up and all of them knew about it. So it's changing very quickly. As it was first described to me, actually, I went to some Anthropocene working groups in Berlin, and there's this almost science fiction concept to it of saying, what will be the evidence left behind a million years from now of humanity? And what will geologists of the future see? And really kind of at the core of it is this question of how do we define what it means to be human with respect to the environment? And what does that, what does that look like? It is, some of the criticisms of the Anthropocene concept are that not all humans are people making these changes. Some people have argued it should be the capitalocene, if it's capitalistic systems that are driving the changes rather than all humanity. What things can we fix and what do we have to live with? And I think this is, for me, a really important aspect. And this is one that comes up in a lot of conversations I have, for instance, with Francine McCarthy, which is, some people have argued that the Anthropocene is inherently pessimistic, because if we define it by climate change, you might be saying, well, we're in a new epoch, we don't have the Holocene climate anymore. So if you're saying that we can't go back, does that mean that, we're giving up on the thought of resolving climate change or bringing back, atmospheric CO2 levels to pre-industrial levels? Or are we giving up on, any kind of these measures, say if it's microplastics or plastics? Are we saying that this is forever? Are we saying that we can't reverse it? But of course, there are things that we can fix. And there are some things that we can't necessarily. For instance, invasive species are extremely hard to turn back the clock on, as are species extinctions. So there's certain elements that will be, or especially in the biosphere, that are seen as permanent. And those are maybe the more grounded elements of the Anthropocene. Then this question of, should we stop spending all of this time and effort on trying to reverse things that we can't reverse and focusing more on how do we live with these changes to the environment? So all of this has now led to this kind of program theme at the museum. And again, I'm trying to think more sort of comprehensively and transdisciplinarily that I would say is an Anthropocene program theme about really fundamental conversation of human choices. One of the things I think is a really powerful lesson from Crawford Lake is that the impacts to the environment and to the lake don't scale to population. So you have changes, the lake is always listening. You have changes in response to farming in the 1200s, but those changes were arguably smaller than, and that's from several villages over hundreds of years. In the 1870s, you have one family moving from England and having arguably the largest change to the chemistry of the lake and even the visible texture of the sediments in its history, in its recent history. And now we have over 100,000 people visiting the lake every year, and you see a different kind of change from that. So we have what we see is kind of emerging from that is that it's not so much about how many people were there, but what choices people are making in terms of how they live with the environment. And I think that that's a very powerful message right now. It's also a really nice opportunity to start addressing how climate change is just one factor of what we need to think about, and alongside biodiversity and social justice crises, and thinking about climate solutions in terms of social improvement. So it's not just about getting to net zero, but it's about how do we improve the situation that we're in with climate, biodiversity, and social systems all intertwined. And what I like to bring with that is this idea of really in urban living. And we're at a point in Earth's history where most humans now live in cities. Does that, we have a tendency to assume that cities are, by various degrees, impairments of natural systems. And I think it's a really nice time to actually put some questions to that. And does it have to be that way? Can cities be places where actually they're centers of conservation for biodiversity? Can we have endangered species that will survive climate change and be able to persist through the next few centuries of climate change in refugia in cities that are created by human communities that are fostering those connections? Do we have to assume that we are kind of the worst places and that we just have to sort of limit our sort of inherent evil of an urban area? And I think that there's actually a lot of really interesting research coming out of this in Australia right now that I've been engaging with as well. And as an illustration of this, this is actually a picture from Seoul, where I didn't take this picture, but I was there last week. This is a river called Cheonggyecheon. And it was until about 2005, that was an elevated highway through the middle of the city. That was kind of a Gardner style highway. And in 2005, the mayor basically dictated that he really wanted it to be a river. And so they took out the highway and they put in a river. And it's been a really interesting place globally in terms of as a precedent. I mean, quite an early precedent of change that's happening in a lot of places now. But that whole area of Seoul became about 4 degrees Celsius cooler. So it's a reprieve from urban heat island effect and heat waves. It's turned an area that was an area to pass through into a destination. It's really long. You can take about an hour walking along it, and it connects then through to the main river of Seoul as well. You can feel when you go there that it's a popular place. I was there in the evening, and there was people playing music. It's a site of a focal point for biodiversity in the city. So there were herons fishing in the river when I was there at night. You could hear cicadas in the greenery. And so it was really kind of interesting to see. And actually one of the other, I was reading a bunch of these kind of meta-analyses and long-term studies of it. And they found that, for instance, traffic improved in the city after they turned the highway into a river. Because more people started taking public transit. And so there was a change in society, and it turned one of the worst areas of the city into one of the best. So there's really interesting kind of co-benefits we can start thinking about, beyond the role of this as a climate adaptation and climate mitigation measure, but as a place of urban improvement that I think are really interesting. So I'm working right now, and I know I'm getting towards the end and I still have another section, so I'll rush a little bit here. I'm working on an exhibition called Crawford Lake, Golden Spike. And, again, I'm kind of moving up these different things. So I've had collections, but now being able to tie in just really broadly these ideas that we're surrounded by timekeepers. There are things around us, whether it's rocks from Ontario. This is actually a tree that we got from Doug Larson. It's a 1,200-year-old white cedar that grew on the Niagara Escarpment. So you have these long histories of environmental records in Ontario as well. And then this is a artwork called the Bead Spitter, which is actually by a local Wyandot artist, Catherine Tamaro, which represents a Crawford Lake sediment core, and it's suspended in Crawford Lake water when it's displayed. And so that's kind of a fun way to be. I can't actually show our frozen Crawford Lake sediment core, but we can use art to represent it as well and to show the and again, thinking just transdisciplinarily, we can kind of bring in different elements that also tie together the indigenous history of the lake and the indigenous future relationships with the lake as well. Something I didn't mention is that we can't actually core or take sediments from the lake anymore, essentially right now because of indigenous, out of respect for First Nations, respect for the personhood of the lake. So we took some sediments for one last analysis last spring, and we're almost not given permission. And at this point, it's basically a moratorium on coring there. So there's a very interesting relationship developing with First Nations and the Canadian and the conservation group there and academics. And I think that that dynamic was actually one of the reasons it was selected as the golden spike, because it's not a free for all. You know, it's not a protected area where no one can go, but it's also not a free for all where once you say it's a golden spike that everyone is going to be going there from all around the world and just coring it to oblivion. So it's a very kind of interesting dynamic that ended up where the First Nations played a really valuable role, I would say. In terms of exhibition Anthropocene themes, we were able to tie in, you know, we call them the 4 Fs. So thinking about food, the way people gather food; frontier, the way people move around over time; fire, humans have a long history, some would say even sort of a coevolution with fire and the creation and spread of fire around the world. And then also fight. So the measures of the sort of signals of human conflict throughout time have been there. And along the bottom here are just things that we were able to tie in from the Crawford Lake sediments themselves that tell these stories specifically to Ontario. So we have purslane. There's a lot of purslane pollen as well at the times of agriculture, earlier periods in the 12 to 1400s. So we're looking now into whether that was one of the crops or if it was just a weed, which is kind of what we consider it here now, or something in between. And maybe it was a weed that was also eaten advantageously. We have kind of a funny old car that's encased with calcite that was, I think, left there, probably retrieved from the bottom of the lake and probably dropped there by one of the Crawford family kids. In terms of fire, we can start thinking about not only early human use of fire and spread of it, but also our love of burning fossil fuels as a source of energy now, and Ontario's long history with that as well. So we have the fly ash, we have the oldest oil extraction sites in North America here in Ontario, and we also have the longest running refinery on the planet in Sarnia. So we have a long history with that. And then for fight, we're actually looking into bringing in the dish with one spoon wampum. So we have the plutonium signal from nuclear weapons testing, but we also have there's signals of the Little Ice Age and the Beaver Wars in the 1600s, and the end of that is the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. Which is signified by the dish with one spoon wampum belt, and all about living better with the planet. So there's a lot of different pieces that can tie together with a story for Crawford Lake. And this is just to show that some of these signals in the history of Lake can tie even together with multiple aspects. For example, corn is a factor of people moving. It was a crop that was developed 7,000 years ago in Mexico, and but it's also a source of food. So there's different kind of ways, and we can tie it together. What I really want to have as a key takeaway is this idea that what we have in terms of humanity and what we can see here, not all of these things are, quote, Anthropocene, but these are all human. And I like the idea of trying to get people to understand that what we see as the Anthropocene now is essentially a scaling up of long-term human patterns of how we've interacted with the planet, and seeing, every time that we had measures of fighting, for instance, with the plutonium signals, we can also see those reversals. We can see 1963, that's the signing of the Test Ban Treaty. We can see in 1701, the Great Peace from the dish with one spoon wampum belt. So I think there's an element of hope here and kind of instruction looking forward, and how we can learn from our history and how we've dealt with things previously in these ways that we interact with the planet, and what that should mean for the next step going forward. I'll kind of I'll run through this. This is another one of my favorite places for sort of urban and natural integration. Here is the Evergreen Brickworks. Um, the question is, what degree is there value in removing climate change from our conversations? So thinking more broadly about the Anthropocene and just social improvements. Um, there's a lot of heavy social emotional charge that people have. Sometimes if you say we're going to have a climate change conversation today, people will remove, well, whether they're climate change deniers or dismissive of it, or whether they have eco-anxiety and they're really worried about it. There's a lot of reasons people might remove themselves from that conversation. So here we get into that point of really going beyond decarbonizing and looking at better ways to live with the environment. And I think that that's where you get a more valid source of optimism too, and you're really looking locally at what we're doing. There was a video for Museum Next Green Museum Summit that I had put together called "We Can Stop Talking About Climate Change," and so it was kind of a fun thing coming back to what I do as a curator. We were able to go around with the video team at the museum, go to Toronto Islands, talk about this as the largest urban car-free community in North America, and how there's a lot of reasons people would want to live there that have nothing to do with it being closer to net zero or a carbon footprint of the place, but just in terms of community and peace and quiet and safety. And clearly there's a 30-year wait list for people to live there. So there's a lot of demand for places like that. And really, going back to this idea of it being a communicator, I can see that people get trapped in the language we use. And so I think having these new communication strategies that are a lot broader than just climate change and decarbonization have been really valuable for me. And I had a few slides on the language of hope. Originally, I thought that I was going to be speaking for an hour, and I realized I was like, I'll just put it all in. But I'll kind of wrap up a little bit quickly. But no one's too tired. I don't see too many snoring faces. Okay. So I mentioned I was in Seoul last week. I was at a museum of the National Hangul Museum, which is the language of Korea. So this was actually some slides I just presented last week about how I've been using language in terms of, and how I've developed a strategy with language at several scales at the museum. And one is just focusing on the theme of hope and changing, how we talk about climate change away from a sort of a fear-based perspective and towards a more forward-looking kind of constructed perspective. So for instance, climate change communication often focuses historically on concern about the negative impact. And there's this idea that if we're not doing enough, it's because we're not scared enough. And I felt that, again, this might work for some, but also there's a lot of disengagement and eco-anxiety that can come out from that approach. I also realized that a lot of people, I think, were just more scared of climate change solutions than they were of climate change itself. And so there was a big gap to be filled in terms of discussing how positive climate change solutions can be for society and for people, and just focusing on that discussion. And thinking again about the urban benefits. And a place where I did that is that Wildlife Photographer of the Year, as I mentioned earlier. I also really wanted at the next stage out to really focus on changing the language, the words that we were using, and getting more clarity. I felt that there's a lot of issues in terms of vague or kind of confusing terms like referring to solar panels as green, or even the term solution to climate change. Who, when, and how would we define it as ever being solved? Net zero, one could argue, will be probably the worst. The year that we reach net zero will probably be the year of the highest greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, which would be the worst year that we'll be experiencing climate change. And a lot of people think of that as the end point of the solution. And that, to me, that's kind of where the solution begins. That's where we start getting regenerative systems, and we start trying to get back and cutting back to prior atmospheric levels or pre-industrial levels. So and then who's going to be the one? I don't think my children will be living long enough to ever see it as being determined as being solved. So what is a better term to use in terms of climate change? So then also becoming more mindful of words, thinking about these fresh conversations. We also then sidestep some of these old sort of entrenched positions that you get in conversations. If you're talking about liking something that's green and working on climate change solutions, sometimes people will get their back up and expect a certain set of conversation. But if you take a new framework and new words that you start basing that conversation from, it allows, I think, for a more fresh start to a conversation on new footing. So I've been engaging different experts to consider how we even develop alternative terms in using with my museum communications. And for instance, with the mom critical minerals case, we didn't want to talk about green technologies or sustainable mining. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to mine something sustainably if it's a finite resource. But thinking about best practices or minimizing impacts. It doesn't have to be reinventing the wheel, but just getting better clarity. Or for instance, with the Anthropocene, you can't really solve an epoch, but you can ameliorate it. So I think I put a lot of thought into the words that we use in terms of the communications. Okay, so we had hope, and then we have the words we use in terms of the actual English language, and then also bringing in indigenous languages and other languages has been really important to me. And I think fundamentally, if we limit all of our communications in the museum to the colonial language of the place, it does reinforce in a certain sense the cultural system and the dialogue that was founded on an extractive relationship with the landscape. So I think bringing in more Anishinaabe-Mowin and Ganyangaha and different languages of this land, it starts reframing how we think of the landscape. And these were languages that had developed in response to the biological and landscape and the climate landscape of this place. And so I think that every opportunity there's been to bring more indigenous languages in, also again as a social support for these communities, but as well as broader awareness of place and what makes this place unique and special has been really important to me. And so one of the first ways that we did this is, so we've been doing this working with Indigenous museum staff as well as community members. This is an image from, these were on the walls of the Wildlife Photography of the Year last year, where we brought in single words in consultation with Anishinaabe community members in Manitoulin Island. But we're now working with this year around to bring in 4 or 5 Ontario Indigenous languages and to really kind of have it as even more educational resources. So Indigenous community members or non-Indigenous community members who are interested in learning these languages can actually practice and hear longer descriptions and cultural learnings that associate with the Wildlife Photographer of the Year exhibition. So this is a direction that we're taking in the museum. And at the top of the curatorial duties was research. So I'm going to leave that to last. And I will run through this quickly. I know I promised that several times, but I really promise now that I'll keep that. But essentially, I mentioned at the beginning, I've worked in all these places around the world. I think this is a really valuable time to focus in on local questions and really starting to work on urban waters interfaces and thinking about Toronto, where I'm at a community place. So I've set up projects that look at how we're doing climate adaptation issues here. This is a picture of that same stream, Chongyechon in Seoul, that I took the evening I was there last week. But how can I highlight more public awareness of these kinds of things that are happening in Toronto and in other communities? I have an undergrad student right now who's looking at sponge cities in Chinese literature and Chinese language literature that he's going to write as a review in English. We're working on an original book. Here's an image of one of these sort of landscape architecture images for the Portland's flood protection project, where they're creating a new wetlands. I have starting a collaboration right now with Waterfront Toronto and the TRCA, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, to start looking at doing research there to look at greenhouse gas emissions associated with our changes to the Don River and other rivers around here. And I have an ongoing student now project with a professor at TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, Claire Oswald. So looking at road salt application in the city and seeing how that interacts with carbon cycling across the city. And then finally, I actually did a perspective piece. I wrote a perspective piece called The Anthropocene Meal with Dr. Francine McCarthy, again, talking about ameliorating the Anthropocene epoch and projecting as a solution to the epoch, again, thinking like, where do we consider it as being done? Arguing that a nice destination would be to be able to walk down to the Don River or have a, easy, pleasurable trip down to the Don River, sit outside, have a nice meal of salmon and maybe some wild rice and some tea, and that's it. But the salmon would come from the river, the tea would be made from the river water, and to get to that meal, you would have to overcome, you'd have to change the urban design in terms of being able to actually access the side of the Don River easily, which you can't really do right now. For it to be pleasant, you can't have a highway roaring by it. So you'd have to take out the Don Valley, the parkway, probably turn it into maybe a streetcar route, something like that could work. You'd have to change the ecosystem health is the second major barrier. So you have to make sure that the river is clean enough to drink. You'd have to make sure that the food is clean enough is safe enough to eat. And then you have to address the cultural barriers. So it can be safe, it can be accessible, but people might still be icky about drinking Don River water. And those are the kind of barriers that the museums can help people overcome, working with communities and trying to normalize and change our fundamental relationship with the environment here. And if you can get to a point where the Don River is clean enough to eat and you can sit by it peacefully and have that meal, you've done a lot to solve the situation and to solve those problems. And that's kind of a tangible endpoint. And I used just as a picture here, this place, which was my favorite when I lived in Berlin. That was one of my favorite cafes. It was called Prinzessinnengarten, so Princess Gardens. And it was just this really nice sort of woodsy place. And there was a community farm right there and these little kind of sheds where you could buy sausages. And until I think 2008, on the left, it had just been a parking lot. And then the community took over the parking lot and turned it into this forest and urban garden. And again, a beautiful opportunity where you took one of the worst places you can imagine in the city and made it one of the best. And so I think there's a lot of hope again on that local level. And yeah, I'll leave it on that. It's really great to be invited by Sara. Thank you so much. And happy to answer any questions if there's time. So, thanks.